All right, so what are we looking at here? What does this diagram represent? What are some things you guys see up here? Well, first of all, let's start with this. What is this right here?
The brain.
That's the brain, and this is the spinal cord. And what part of the nervous system are the brain and spinal cord part of? The central nervous system. Good, so we have the central nervous system here, but then we have all this other stuff going on. And these are effector organs right here, but we have these sets of neurons that are traveling from different areas of the central nervous system to these effector organs. And my question to you is, what are these neurons that are represented here? What are they part of? What is this diagram ultimately representing? What are we looking at here?
The para and the sympathetic.
We're looking at the autonomic nervous system. This is the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system, which contains in the peripheral nervous system has a sensory component and it has a motor component. Is the autonomic nervous system part of the sensory division or the motor division of the peripheral nervous system?
Motor.
It's motor. Good. That's an important thing to realize, is that the autonomic nervous system is part of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. Now there's two different divisions of the autonomic nervous system. What are those two divisions? The sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Which division is represented right here? What are we looking at right there? Is that the sympathetic or the parasympathetic division?
Sympathetic.
It's the sympathetic division. Good. How do you know that? What about this diagram lets you know that we're looking at the sympathetic nervous system right there?
The thoracic and lumbar.
It has to do with where the sympathetic motor neurons originate from. Motor neurons for the sympathetic nervous system originate in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Okay, so that lets you know that it's part of the sympathetic division. What is this structure right there? And I will say it runs parallel. It runs right next to the spinal cord. It runs parallel to the spinal cord, and there's one on either side of the spinal cord. What is this structure?
The chain.
That's the sympathetic chain. And what happens in the sympathetic chain? Or maybe I should start with this. How many sympathetic neurons does it take to get from the spinal cord to the effector organ? It takes two. It takes two neurons to get from the spinal cord to the effector organ. That being said, what happens in the sympathetic chain?
The post, is it postsynaptic or
Takes two motor neurons, two sympathetic neurons to get from the spinal cord to the effector organ, and most of those sympathetic neurons are going to synapse with each other in the sympathetic chain. As far as terminology is concerned, there's a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. A ganglion is a collection of nerve cell bodies, and this sympathetic chain represents a ganglia. It's the sympathetic chain ganglia. So what's going to happen is that sympathetic neurons are going to come out of the spinal cord and they're going to, preganglionic sympathetic neurons are going to come out of the spinal cord, and they're going to synapse with postganglionic neurons in that sympathetic chain. That's where those two neurons communicate with each other. What's the neurotransmitter that's released by this preganglionic sympathetic neuron onto the postganglionic sympathetic neuron? It's acetylcholine. Okay, so we have acetylcholine that's released from the pre onto the postganglionic sympathetic neuron. But then we have this postganglionic neuron that's going to travel from the sympathetic chain all the way onto the effector organ. And what is the neurotransmitter that's released by the postganglionic sympathetic neuron onto the effector organ? What are these sympathetic neurons going to be releasing? What neurotransmitter onto their effector organs? Norepinephrine. Norepinephrine. Good. Or noradrenaline. What do we call the sympathetic division? When is the sympathetic division activated?
Fight or flight.
Fight or flight. The sympathetic division is fight or flight. And so you have this sensory information that comes into the central nervous system, and as a response to that, in certain situations, the central nervous system, specifically the hypothalamus or the brainstem, is going to activate the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response. So it sends that information down the spinal cord, it activates these sympathetic motor neurons, and these sympathetic motor neurons are going to ultimately release norepinephrine onto their effector organs. What's going to happen when norepinephrine is released onto the heart? It's going to beat more quickly and more forcefully. What's going to happen when norepinephrine is released onto the lungs, onto the tubes, the bronchioles or the lungs? Are those lungs going to, are those bronchioles, is the respiratory tract, is it going to dilate or is it going to constrict?
Dilate.
It's going to dilate, because when you dilate, that allows more airflow. And we want more air during these fight or flight responses, exercise, anxiety, all that type of stuff. What's it going to do to the digestive system? Is it going to increase digestive activity or decrease digestive activity? It's going to decrease digestive activity. Good. All right, so that's the sympathetic nervous system. And in general, you have short preganglionic neurons. They just travel from the spinal cord to the sympathetic chain. And then you have these long postganglionic sympathetic neurons that travel from the chain all the way to the effector organ. All right, so if this is the sympathetic division, that makes this the parasympathetic division. And what do you notice about the motor neurons for the parasympathetic division? Where do they originate from? Up here in the brainstem. They originate from the brain, specifically the brainstem. And so what does that tell you about these nerves that are taking these parasympathetic motor neurons from the brainstem to the effector organs? What type of nerves are taking them from the brainstem to the effector organ? Those are cranial nerves. I should back up and say that all of these sympathetic motor neurons are traveling through spinal nerves, through thoracic and lumbar spinal nerves. Over here in the parasympathetic division, a lot of the parasympathetic motor neurons are traveling through cranial nerves out of the brainstem. The parasympathetic nervous system also originates from the sacral region of the spinal cord. and it can reach effector organs that way. And in this case, these motor neurons are traveling through spinal nerves, through sacral spinal nerves. When is the parasympathetic nervous system activated?
Resting.
During periods of resting and digesting. Good. So what are these parasympathetic motor neurons? What are they going to do to the salivary glands?
Increase.
They're going to stimulate them. They're going to stimulate the production of saliva, releasing saliva into your mouth to help you moisten up that food. What's it going to do to the lungs? Is it going to result in bronchodilation or bronchoconstriction?
Constriction.
Constriction, because we really don't need a lot of airflow when we're just resting. What's it going to do to the heart? It's going to slow it down. What's it going to do to the digestive system in general? Activity of the digestive system.
Increase.
Muscle activity of the digestive system. Glandular activity of the digestive system.
Increase.
It's going to stimulate it. Yeah, because our priority in this case is digesting food, resting and digesting. Now, how many motor neurons does it take to get from the central nervous system to the effector organ for the parasympathetic nervous system?
2.
It also takes 2. But there's no chain ganglion here. So what happens is that you have this really long preganglionic neuron. And the preganglionic neuron, travels out, in this case, through the vagus nerve, the cranial nerve. And that preganglionic neuron pretty much in a lot of cases reaches the effector organ. And once it's on the effector organ, that's when it synapses with the postganglionic neuron. And then the postganglionic neuron releases its neurotransmitter onto the effector organ. Do you guys know the neurotransmitter that's released by both the pre- and postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system? Acetylcholine. Okay. Acetylcholine. Okay, good. Any questions about this? We're going to see this all throughout Biology 242. Because guess what we talk about in 242? Respiratory system, cardiovascular system, digestive system, urinary system. And all of these are regulated by the autonomic nervous system. Okay.